Live everywhere.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, December 11th, 2017. Time for yet another show, yet another week of the Presidential Apprentice, of course. And, man, it's just, it's unbelievable what continues to happen out there. The president apparently has his phone back, or at least got it back for the weekend. We will see. I haven't checked in to see whether he has been rage tweeting yet this morning. Something I usually don't find out until airtime, but I don't see. Usually my Twitter feed is aflame if that's happening. Bill may know exactly what's going on. Daily Kos Radio is live now, or maybe not. Kagro X, that's me, hi, may just stay in bed watching TV till 9:30 like the president does. And frankly, I can't criticize. That does sound like a very good idea. It might not be the best way for a president to spend his time, but it's probably not the worst way in the world for this president to spend his time. It's annoying, and we have to hear about what's on Fox News Channel if he does that. But then he's not up doing things or pressing any buttons, presumably. And that's always a good thing when you keep his hands off the buttons. And we'll have to check in with what else is happening in the news. I imagine he'll be rage tweeting shortly because there appears to have been an explosion in the New York City subways, a pipe bomb. Greg Mitchell says it appears to be a modest pipe bomb. It really didn't want to claim credit for it at all. It's all due to you. I just want to let everybody know that the many people who contributed to me becoming a pipe bomb, it's that sort of modesty, I guess. But so far, as he says, it went off prematurely, and the guy supposedly who had it with him, I guess, was injured, but doesn't even have life-threatening injuries. You can't even depend on these things anymore. I mean, people can't make a quality pipe bomb these days. So we'll see what's going on here. I see other reports say the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force now assisting in investigating the Manhattan Transit explosion. For New York, this mostly means a lot of people who are angry about being late to work, and not considerably much more so. Good news on that front. America produces the most incompetent pipe bomb makers, and we're happy about that. Don't change the whole STEM training program. They're just going to get better. I say keep them incompetent, at least at this level. All right, so we'll find out what's happening. Get some word on that. Maybe Greg Dworkin is scanning the television waves or trying to figure out exactly what's going on that front. He's got 15 other stories ready to go. This is the week where we find out what Alabama is made of, after all, and lots of interesting stories about Alabama's concerted effort to suppress the minority vote so that, it wasn't originally done so that Roy Moore could win the Senate, but it would be, for those folks, a happy byproduct, perhaps, though more and more Republicans in Alabama declaring that they simply won't have anything to do with the man. So, I don't know. We get a very weird cross-section of the stories. The only one that matters, of course, will be told on Tuesday of this week, and Wednesday could be a hell of a day. We'll see how that one goes. Joan McCarter will be with us, hopefully, on Wednesday, as well as Greg Dworkin, to help us either celebrate the good news that Alabama has come through or mourn the loss of, democracy in America, I suppose, or at least the prospect of arresting pedophiles these days instead of sending them to the United States Senate. But I still have my fingers crossed for Alabama. I don't know what the polls are saying these days, but I can't put a great deal of faith in what people are telling pollsters when the question is, are you going to vote for a pedophile or not? So I'm a little worried about that. But like I said, Alabama has come through. Doug Jones is most famous, as we know, for prosecuting Klansmen and doing it successfully in Alabama for the church bombings. And like I said, they didn't import juries from out of state to find these guys guilty. They convinced Alabamians to do the right thing, and with a strong argument, you're able to do it. Some interesting articles, though, that we'll pull into the knowledge web for the day, and tell you what's going on down in Alabama with regard to the voter ID law and how they've been implementing it. Not a surprise, certainly, but I did see at least one report that made the rounds on Twitter suggesting that every one of, well, not suggesting, just asserting outright that every one of Alabama's counties in which those counties or in those counties where African Americans make up more than 75% of the registered voters, every one of those counties is seeing, as part of the so-called budget crisis in Alabama, seeing their DMV offices closed. So in other words, you've got to show up to vote these days with a driver's license, but if you live in a county where the majority of registered voters are African American, you got to leave the county to get yourself one of the IDs that's required to show up and vote. I don't know how many counties in Alabama have 75% or more of their registered voters being African American. I don't know how many. I don't know how many counties they've got, but they have been closing these driver's license offices all over the state, and I guess a total of 31 of them are closing down. I imagine some of them are in counties where less than 75% of the registered voters are African American, but it's a hell of a way to put the thing. Now, if I guess we'd have to get a count. Honestly, if there's just one county, then it won't shock us to find out that it's being treated that way. Okay, where is my Skype? How come it won't come up? Oh, Skype is having trouble opening. Hang on there, Greg. Almost there. Dang it. This is not good for, hang on a second, Greg. For whatever reason, Skype on the computer that actually controls everything didn't ring, but the Skype on the computer that doesn't control the show did ring and made it really loud and annoying. Let me, let's see. If you're listening along, yeah, I know no answer on the phone. Let me give you a message. Okay, let's see. This is going to pose a challenge this morning. All right. And I don't know how I can silence the laptop on this. Anyway, all right. Well, for whatever reason, the Skype on the big computer. There we go. See here now. That's the really super loud version of that, and those of you on the radio will have heard that. Maybe an echo. All right. Good morning, Greg. Everything, Greg?
Yeah, I'm just waiting for things to clean up at your end.
Oh, okay. Well, you tell me how long that takes.
Okay. We'll say something.
Okay. Hi. How you doing? Is that working?
There's like a double sound here.
Okay, I think I know what's going on. Let's pretend it's not going on, and then all right. You know what we're gonna have to do is all right. Hang on a second. This is sort of a hangover of the troubles we were having from before we replaced the computer. That is making itself more annoying each day. I think we've got it cleared up now because the laptop. As you may recall, one of the symptoms of installing the new audio system on the laptop was that loopback audio, which controls everything, will not allow the computer to shut loopback off at any point. And now we go.
I'm going to hang up and call again because I'm just hearing everything twice.
Oh, okay. Try it again. That's bad news. Let's see. What else can we work with that might undo some of this? That should do it. All right, one more try. All right, Greg, any better?
No,
Apparently
actually,
not.
what I'm doing is I'm hearing you twice, but there's like a 15-second lag. It's the weirdest thing.
That is weird. Okay. Well, that's inexplicable at the moment, but all right. Well, we'll continue to try to work with it. I got one or two ideas about how we might undo this thing. Perhaps it has to do with, where else might this be coming from? All right. Well, sorry, Greg. Why would this be happening? I made a change on the podcast setup so that I could include audio from iTunes, so that I could play the contribution that we got last week that I was unable to use because of the setup wasn't ready for it. So I included the sound from iTunes. That should not have made a big difference in all of this, and I can't really explain why it would. I guess I should know by now not to touch anything ever once you have things working. All right. Well, that's shocking. Do I want to test it with Armando's Skype? Sure, Armando, give it a shot. Why don't we try it and see if that's an idea? I suppose it's possible that something changed on Greg's end. This is exciting radio, though. I will admit that. This is super fantastic. Okay, we'll give it a try. And Armando, if you are willing to call in, we'll try. The rest of you can all call in too. Why don't we all do it, and we'll just do things that way. All right, let's see whether Armando's phone works. Hey, Armando, how are you?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay, I hear you. The question is, how many times do you hear me?
Once.
Oh, all right. Well, that's good. I haven't. Well, I did turn off the iTunes. I can't imagine that would have anything to do with it. I guess I could try turning it back on and see if you become so annoyed that you hang up.
Okay,
but otherwise, if not, then maybe Greg needs to press some buttons instead. All right. Well, it's on. That doesn't make any difference to you?
Not one bit.
All right. Fantastic. Or else maybe you're just not paying any attention.
Or both.
Well, I have all of Greg's stories, and we can certainly discuss a bunch of those things. You had a busy weekend.
Oh, my God.
We can certainly begin with that story as well. Did you make it to D.C. for the...
I did not.
You didn't? Oh. There were probably people wandering around introducing themselves to people hoping they were Armando. Okay.
I wanted to avoid the Richard Spencer fate of getting punched in the face.
Oh,
so,
wow.
No, actually I had a family thing, so it just didn't work out for me on Friday, and then Saturday was a half session, and it just wasn't worth it. But I did have a busy weekend anyway, fighting about all that stuff, so if you want to talk about it, I'm obviously ready to do it, but if you want to talk about Greg's stuff, that's fine too. I just wanted to call in to see if it was your system as opposed to Greg's. Greg's wrong again.
I knew that was going to happen eventually. We would figure that out. Well, I'm not sure, but we'll try and work with Greg at some point, perhaps in the evening, and we'll get his sound system figured out, or mine, whichever it is. In the meantime, I've got his list of stories, so I can certainly cover that. But did you? I imagine you must have watched what went on at the.
Yeah, I did,
DNC
I watched Kagro style on Twitter a lot as well. But I've got there's actually a very good write-up of what happened by Chris Reeves.
Oh, excellent! I'd like to
Tom
see that.
Servo at Daily Kos. I highly recommend it. It is sober. Credits everyone with acting in good faith, which I do not.
But it was nice.
So if you want an unbiased take on what happened, Chris provides very good write-up. By the way, Chris is one of those people who, David, you always talk about. You want to have a voice. You want to get involved. You want to have some influence. Show up for meetings.
Yes.
Chris is your poster person. He's a member of the DNC from Kansas. He was a Cossack of long standing. I recall when he announced he was running for a DNC slot, he went to all the meetings, he drummed up the support, he got elected, and now he has a voice on the DNC.
And people from all over come to Daily Kos to say he is an insider hack and a sellout. As a result,
they don't. They're all pretty. Everyone has a lot of respect for Chris on all sides.
That is good news.
And and he handles it extremely well. He may have his points of view, but at least when he's talking about things, he's very sober, very civil, and explains his point of view without besmirching anybody else. Completely different from me. So he's the right guy for that job, and I honestly hope that sometime in the future he moves up the ranks to like rules and bylaws and other important committees. Being from Kansas also gives him a great perspective on things like caucuses and just the general workings of what needs to be done in tough red states like Kansas. Anyway, enough about Chris.
Let's talk about
let's talk about me and my big fights. The meetings happened, as you might recall, David, and as the listeners might recall, there were, in my mind, three big issues. People will talk about the transparency and budgeting issues as if they were really that important. I personally think they weren't. Nothing actually was adopted on that, or nothing meaningful in my view. But plus, if you care about the DNC because of the money, you're looking in the wrong place. Willie Sutton was asked, apocryphally or maybe truthfully, I don't know, but I know the story, that why did he rob banks? And he said that's where the money is. The DNC is not where the money is. The DNC is almost broke all the time, except when presidential candidates are fundraising for it. The rest of the time, they owe $10 million all the time.
That does. They don't have any money. True, but they're taking on debt to someone. But I assume
but who pays for the debt? And how are they able to take on the debt? Because they know that every 4 years, a presidential candidate is going to raise money.
That's true.
I mean, it's just a fact. Look, I personally say you can have all the money that the DNC has. Go work with that and invoke your 50-state strategy. You'll be giving $10 a state. Good luck with what you're going to do with that. Anyway, I'll leave that to the people who want to argue about that. I'll talk about things I do want to argue about, which were three things: superdelegates,
yes,
primary rules, and caucus rules. Superdelegates, it was etched in stone before the meeting even occurred. It was written right into the resolution, as I've been pointing out, and you've been allowing me to point out on your show. They adopted the rule that very special superdelegates, which are the elected officials, will remain, in essence, superdelegates. Members of Congress, elected officials, people of that stripe. DNC members and lower level, not so special superdelegates will not remain unbound. Their votes will be cast in proportion to the results of the primary or caucus results in their state. Therefore, while they still get to go, they get credentialed, they get to walk on the floor, they get to do all the things, and they have free votes on all the rules and things. On the presidential contest, their votes are bound. Their votes will be cast as voters decide. That's a good thing. I think that most people were resigned to it, in the sense that if you wanted all superdelegates eliminated, that wasn't going to happen. And if you wanted all superdelegates preserved, that wasn't going to happen either. So that was not as very controversial. It happened.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah, it'll cause some difficulties in the future, but there'll be intra-squad difficulties, and each state will have to settle its own problems. But where it will cause problems is where you're supposed to make your delegate voting proportional to the outcome of your primary, or I guess there's still going to be some caucuses out there, and you have to do the math, and then you're going to find every once in a while in some state. Look, I have been just to use the same players again, because I don't want to guess at who's going to be running in 2020 or any future years. But if you had the same players, I've been I've been on Clinton's team for 30 years, and you're telling me that I understand that my state's vote came out, say, heavily in favor of Sanders, and we want to be proportional here. But as between you, me, and the chairman of the state party here, two of us who are, of the three of us who are diehard Clinton supporters, are going to have to switch our votes in order to keep our proportions right. Who's going to take it who's going to take it on the chin and vote for the person that they don't actually support, and who's going to call Hillary's team and say, yeah, I know, but I'm forced. They'll understand, but you're going to find people who are going to the convention and saying, I have rights to attend the convention by virtue of my having worked in the Democratic Party, organizing here for decades, and my job is to go and vote for the person I don't actually support because math, and that kind of sucks.
That's it.
But, you live with it. You do it and you live with it.
And there was a wrinkle that Chris Reeves explained and has great concern about, which is there's also these neutrality rules for state party officials. With regard to the conduct of the race, and this was one of the reasons why he thought you can't eliminate superdelegates, because then those state party officials will have to actually align with somebody. They'll have to be. That's true too. They have to run for somebody.
Yeah, if they want to.
If they want to be a delegate, you have to pick one of the candidates. So the idea of neutrality plus elimination of superdelegates was difficult, in that it basically meant these state party officials would not be able to be delegates in any capacity if the rules that some of us were arguing for, which is complete elimination, would occur. Now, see, I never was concerned about that, and I'm still not really concerned about it because I don't think it really matters if they're delegates or not. But more importantly, I don't think they are being biased at the party should matter anyway, because if you have a primary run by the state government, the state party has nothing to say to it. They don't run the elections.
That's true too.
It's only when there's caucuses does that become an issue.
I guess that's possibly true. And
you see, the only thing the state party or the national party can rig is caucuses.
And yet, caucuses survive.
Oh, yes, and you know why they survive. Now, let's talk about that for a second. Well, first of all, let's talk about it because there's one, to me, there was a get-out-of-jail-free card for some caucus states, and that is their state doesn't run an election, a primary. If your state doesn't run a primary, you really have no choice but to run a caucus to choose your delegates. Or I guess you could have a convention or a smoke-filled room. No one wants that. So caucuses are, as Churchill said, terrible and awful, but better than every other option because at least people can show up and vote when there's no other mechanism. All right. So those were going to survive unless even if you were going to do this, you could have penalized caucus states to pressure state governments who want their citizens to be represented within all of the political parties. You could have put pressure on them to say, hey, you either run a primary or your state doesn't get to represent in my party. That's pretty radical, pretty dastardly, and I did not advocate for that, at least not until. And I'll hold the not until to when we talk about primaries. So really the only reform, other than the reforms that were sort of adopted, it's not clear if it's aspirational or enforceable, is the idea of basically forcing what's called firehouse caucuses, which if you followed this discussion, you will know means basically all-day voting and just dropping off your vote in a box. More like a primary, more like a normal election, except with paper ballots and boxes where you put things in. Plus, they were going to permit, or they're aspirationally requiring is in quotes because it's not clear if it's really required, absentee ballots, no fault absentee voting. So you can go and mail it in, which would be nice. In essence, turn them into what has proven to be the most effective process in elections for increasing voter participation. This is proven in Oregon, Washington, and is being proven in California that mail-in balloting is the most voter-friendly method we have. Yeah. And it's not surprising. It's common sense. You're in your kitchen, you look at your ballot, you bubble in your boxes, or you put in your X. You pay for your stamp, you fold your ballot, you mail it in, and you voted. You didn't even have to leave your house.
Yeah. Wait till people find out that for mailing in votes in a firehouse primary, you're mailing it to the state party headquarters.
Exactly. And the rigging charges will be I tell you, the law of unintended consequences. Primaries, people. Let the state run the election, then no one can be accused of anything.
Well, they will be anyway.
Well, of course,
but
they do.
You know, but there's a process by which you can say, all right, well, I don't know, nobody trusts the process anyway, so I guess we're no worse off, certainly.
Yeah, true enough.
Yes, if the state party is running the firehouse primary, that's who you're mailing the ballot to, and then you'll be upset because your guy won't win, and you'll say, the insiders at the state party, changed my
tossed
ballot.
all my ballots away.
Yeah.
They had to open them and look at them. Oh, I don't want that vote. Throw it away. Yes, of course, it's always going to be a feature of these things. If someone wants to yell rigged, they can and will yell rigged. In that sense,
I've already arranged for someone to do that, as a matter of fact.
It's already arranged.
I've rigged it.
Just because you're holding a contest, it's going to be susceptible to that. The question is, are you going to let yourself be blackmailed by that? And the answer's got to be no. You want transparency. You want everybody to be in the room when the ballots are open. But, then they say, well, they intercepted the whole, look at all these ballot boxes that weren't brought in.
Yeah. It's not a reason not to try it. It's just be aware of it, I guess, is all we can say. We're going to take our first break here. If you're able to hang on and continue the discussion on the after, that would be great. But, all of these things are true. These will arise as problems, and it's not a reason not to try these things. I'm just saying, okay, let's be prepared for those complaints when they arise and how to answer them. And they'll come up, and we'll have another meeting and come up with other ideas. It's okay. No problem. Anyway, we'll be right back after this short break. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Hi, welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We have determined, we're determined to determine that it was all Greg's fault and all this. Lots of comments saying that the live feed sounded okay, and it sounded okay in my headphones as well. Even some comments here saying, hey, don't worry about it. The ring sound when people call in isn't even all that annoying. It comes across really loud in my headphones, so it seems like it's drowning everything out.
It's a good signaler. We know that you're adding a guest.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. Rather than having people sneak in through the back door. Oh, Greg says he's got it fixed, so that's good. He's been probably spending the morning with Skype call testing service and their fabulous British accented robot. So, Greg, if you wanted to give it a shot and cover some stories, you're certainly welcome to join in. If you got to scoot off to work, that is fine, too. We'll cover your subjects. We were, before the break, talking with Armando, and we are again. And I'm assured that those of you who are tuning in for an Armando rant will be satisfied in the next segment.
Yes, you will.
Oh, okay.
It makes my blood boil even now.
All right.
When in our last segment or portion of a segment, we were talking about caucus reform at the Unity and Reform Commission, and we talked about the rules and all. Well, does that really solve the rigging problem? Well, it doesn't. I think we determined, because if you're determined to yell rig, there's always if you just don't trust the people who are counting the votes, then there's nothing you can do. Now. Here's the thing that infuriated me and infuriates me now. Unity and Reform Commission was charged with encouraging the use of primary elections. There was one basic thing they could do, in my view, non-radical, non-drastic, non-draconian. And that is to just tell state parties that if their state holds a primary, they are required to use the results of the primary election.
Simple enough.
Simple enough. And it just strikes me that on what basis could you possibly not want this if you believe in increasing voter participation? Because it is indisputable, and I don't know anyone that disputes it, that primaries have magnitudes more voter participation. We actually have 2 live examples from 2016, and in fact, such a reform would only impact these 2 states. Washington State, where 220,000 Washingtonians participated in the state party-held caucus. 220,000. Okay. But the state government of Washington held an open mail-in primary. And in that, 719,000 Washingtonians participated. That's 500,000 more votes, David. That's 500,000.
Certainly considerable.
How can any party that opposes voter suppression countenance the disenfranchising of 500,000 people? It's not defensible. No. It simply is not. Now, I'll let you know something. I was told that they had reached a compromise that wasn't really acceptable to me, but at least it was a step forward, which was states that have 5 electoral districts or less were going to be exempted. Sort of an Iowa exception, except it also exempted Nebraska, which was the state that would be involved. Now, why exempted Iowa? They don't have a primary. Well, there is no reason to exempt Iowa because there was no reason to. This was a Nebraska exemption, though they tried to call it an Iowa exemption. All right, I wasn't thrilled, but I could live with it. Well, a member of the commission, in good principle, said, no, why are we excluding anybody? If there's a primary, use it.
Okay.
All right. And he put it to the table and it looked like it had the votes to carry. But the designees from Bernie Sanders pitched a fit. But I have to be clear here. Hillary Clinton did a terrible job picking the people on her commission. They were terrible. They weren't prepared. No, they were not prepared. They did not know what they were talking about, and they rolled over and did not defend voters. Terrible, starting with Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, the chairman, Jan Bauer, who represented Iowa party interests and not the voters. And indeed, she didn't even represent Iowa. The theory was that if you passed this amendment, which would have not exempted states with 5 electoral districts or less, but what if a Republican governor or government in Iowa decides to destroy the Iowa caucus by enacting a primary? Well, I would say, well, good for Iowa. Someone actually cares about voters in Iowa. How about that? But let's be practical about this. There's not a snowball's chance in hell that any government in Iowa is going to kill their cash cow called the Iowa caucus.
Yeah, not likely.
It's impossible. It's more likely that we're going to get hit by a meteor. And I mean that literally. It's more likely that we will be hit by a meteor than Iowa government will destroy the Iowa caucus. But they use this excuse to defeat this amendment. That's an outrage. It's unacceptable. It frankly taints the entire process. The entire Unity and Reform Commission process should just be as if it never happened, throw it in the trash can. Let's start over at the Rules and Bylaws Committee.
Wow.
And I say that in all honesty. It was a farce.
Mm. You know what? Just to make things even more unsettled this morning, I'm going to try just one last ditch experiment to see if I can add Greg to our call here.
Okay.
And see if I can
he
get.
Can hear me. He can listen to me yell.
Yeah.
Yell back.
We'll see whether I can.
Back at me.
Yeah. I can't figure out how we can make it. I mean, he's trying to call, and it wasn't giving me the option to add him to your call. It gave me the option to answer his call and put you on hold, and I didn't want to do that. And now I have.
Well, maybe you did, but
no, not according to my stuff. So there's an add. I can add him to a group, but I can't get him to call, or can't get it to call him. I wonder if there's another thing I can do here. Let's see. Is there another? Okay, let's try this one. Add people, and we'll try Greg and see if that works. It should be dialing him. Greg,
what?
Are you there?
I don't know. Am I?
Yes, we hear you. Armando, do you hear him?
I do hear him.
Okay, that's
hey,
excellent.
Armando.
We managed to make that work.
Yeah.
On the old Skype, it was a little easier to find. Now, the mechanics are the same. The buttons are in different places. Okay, no doubling up.
No,
the sound
apparently
for you.
what was happening is Skype was and iTunes were not cooperating. In the old version, if I started the show on iTunes and listened to you, and then I called you on Skype, it would cut out the iTunes and shut it off. And now it doesn't do it. So iTunes keeps going, which I didn't realize.
Excellent.
And that's how come I was hearing double stuff and nobody else was.
Less convenience and service with each update. That's
yeah,
what all
so
the
thanks so
customers
much
want.
for doing that. And speaking of thank yous, Armando, thank you for getting involved in this and explaining all of this over the weekend.
Yes.
I realized that things didn't exactly play out the way you would have wanted in a perfect world. But you were involved and you were explaining why, and very, very useful for those of us who weren't paying as much attention.
Well, I appreciate that, Greg, and I don't know if my involvement was in any way effective, but I have to speak my mind on this because it's look. I'm not doing this. I'm not upset about caucuses, particularly because of 2016. I've always been a caucus opponent, and anybody who's followed me on these things would know this. I hate Iowa, New Hampshire going first, but that's not on the table in these discussions, and probably never will be in my lifetime. But the reality is, it was right there. The process was there. We could have done a little bit of good, and for partisan in the sense of favoring one candidate over another, and this and favoring your state party apparatus. And this, frankly, that's directed at Jane Klebb, who I'm about to blast if David gives me the go ahead on this.
This isn't going to be my fault.
No, it's just I'm going to say some bad things.
Well, we'll listen to them.
I'm not going to curse, and I'm not going to call her any names, but I am going to condemn what she did.
Right. Before you do that, I'm just going to sign myself off. I want to thank you for fixing all of this. I dropped an article, which you might find interesting, by Julia Zari and Seth Maskett, who are two neutral political science types who do not have a dog in this fight. And it's in an op-ed in the New York Times called "Is the Democratic Party Becoming Too Democratic?" And talks about exactly where in the party, too much losing focus on process lies versus not enough. And it's interesting because I just posted it as a link on Daily Kos, and already people who are on the Bernie side are yelling at it as sore losers who just hate Bernie. And the fact is it has nothing to do with it. I only mention that because it just illustrates how difficult it is to get past 2016 with some people, because as Armando was saying, the whole issue of what to do is not about refighting 2016. It's moving forward.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And again, I think the resolution that created the Unity and Reform Commission lays out
Thanks, Greg.
some principles. And if they had just followed the principles that were laid out in that resolution and followed their mandate, in many ways, a lot of people, if you looked at it from the prism of 2016, it would have left everybody unhappy. But that's the whole point. There are things that are about the process as it exists that favored one candidate, and then there was one that favored a different candidate. Caucuses favored Bernie Sanders. Superdelegates, at least in theory, favored Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
I don't really believe that, but eliminate them, right? And work towards, if they think allowing people to register as a Democrat the day of the election is good, and I'm fine with that, and I think that's terrific. More people will vote. If your North Star is getting as many people to vote as possible, which should always be the Democratic Party's North Star, there's nothing more important to the political fortunes of the Democratic Party than more people voting, then that should be guiding every move you make. So therefore, same-day registration, more people, at least in theory, more people will vote in your primary. Good. All right. That makes me for it. Eliminating caucuses in favor of primaries. More people will vote. Good. Let's do that to the degree we can.
All right.
Eliminating superdelegates if you believe they discourage voting and dilute the power of voters. Good. Let's do that. If you see what I'm getting at, David? If you focus not on what's good for your candidate, but what's on good for voters, the answers are actually pretty simple. And this is where I go back to the caucus point and the tabling of the one amendment, which, again, unless you were going to be draconian, and I'll talk about the draconian part in the primaries in a second, was a simple fix. If your state government holds a primary election, you, state party, are bound to honor those results and use them for delegate selection. This should not have been controversial.
But I don't understand.
But that would have hurt Bernie Sanders.
Okay, I guess that's the reason.
That's the reason. Jane Klebb, Bernie Sanders supporter, member of Our Revolution, on the Sanders Institute. In essence, a biased person on this commission, which, by the way, as an aside.
Understandable. Yeah.
No, I got to give you this aside because it is so chutzpah, it's unbelievable. The day before, Namaki Constant, James Zogby went on and on and on about conflicts and recusals, and if you vote now, you can't vote in the Rules Committee. Now, mind you, Zogby didn't think of this rule until he got booted out of the Rules Committee.
Okay.
Because he wouldn't have been for recusal requirements if he had still been on the Rules Committee. Let's be honest.
Probably not.
The dishonesty is manifest. It's so, I mean, they're just plain liars. This is what Jane Klebb lied about. When she says she was against the amendment on caucuses, she said it was to defend the Iowa caucuses. That's a lie. That's a bald-faced lie. She lied. Because, as I explained before, there's not a snowball's chance in hell that any Iowa government would ever damage the Iowa caucus. It is a cash cow for them. We wouldn't talk about Iowa if it wasn't first in the nation. It'd be just another state. We talk about it as much as we talk about Idaho. And I know we talk about Idaho more than most because of John Carter, but you know what I mean.
But absent that, yes, I get the idea. But again, the defense of supposing you wanted to defend it, what was the mechanism they were using? You mentioned if they had fewer than 5 electoral districts,
congressional districts.
Yes, well, yeah. For these purposes, of course, you're electing delegates by district. So congressional districts, easy enough as a metric. Less than 5, then you're what? Exempted from the necessity of honoring your state's
You can hold
primary?
a caucus even if you have a primary. That means Washington would have had to use the primary. Nebraska, I mean, in the current context, Nebraska would have been able to keep caucusing. Mind you, other states that had held caucuses in 2006 have already switched to primaries. Those are Colorado, Minnesota, and Maine. most red states are not going to do it, though Maine is a mixed state. But, Idaho has a caucus, Utah has a caucus, Wyoming has a caucus. I forget the others. But, there's about 15 caucus states, and most of them are red states. I mean, the whole, and that goes to another thing, this whole argument about party building.
Mm-hmm.
Caucuses have never built a party in their time, in their life. And if you just want to look at correlation, if you're a caucus state, you're more likely to be a red Republican state. So all your caucuses have done nothing to build the party. But more importantly, if your whole answer to party building is an event that happens once every 4 years, you shouldn't be in charge of party building.
That's a point. I was going to say, now I can't tell whether it's which came first, the red state status or the caucusing. Now, I like the idea. I mean, I can certainly get behind the idea that you could do better with party building if your red state Democrats were getting together face to face often. But yeah, once every 4 years, I don't think is much of a party building exercise. It's a good event, but I mean, have a convention.
David?
Yeah.
There you are. You faded on me just a bit there. But you're right. And as I said, if they really believed that caucuses were great for party building, they would have caucuses for every nomination. Congressman, state representatives, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, everything should be decided in a caucus. They're not. It's nonsense. It's a lie.
That
it's
I
a lie.
think is probably true.
It's a bald-faced lie. The reason they want caucuses, those that have other options, look, sometimes you got to have a caucus. All these red states that have only caucuses for presidential nomination, they have primaries for everything else. So you don't have to have a caucus. That's why they don't have caucuses. Washington State, ironically, the Washington State Democratic Party, ironically, wanted to hold a caucus. You know why? Because the primary in Washington, the mail-in primary in Washington, was open.
Oh, I see.
So Bernie Sanders blocks the primary in Washington because it's open.
Yeah, that's problematic in terms of holding and defending a real position on what we should be doing for nominating.
They have no problem. They argue one thing one day and one thing the other. And look, I understand you're fighting for your candidate. Bernie Sanders almost certainly is going to run for president again in 2020. He's given every indication, and what he did and what his people did in this Unity and Reform Commission only confirms that. But why are they controlling our party? You talk about rigged, David.
Right. Okay.
You talk about rigged, David. What kind of rigging permits one potential candidate, to have a third of the commission that is recommending the rules for the next contest? Imagine.
Well,
was actually running.
That's probably not actually unusual. It's just unusual that person isn't a member of the party and hasn't been.
I think it is unusual that these are expressly avowed and appointed by the candidate himself.
Well, that's the unusual part of this commission. But I mean, almost certainly in every situation, just by the nature of the people who are running, and it's usually pretty clear years in advance, and people have their allegiances. And as it turns out, you're
I
drawing
agree.
your
And I would
rules
say
committee
this,
people from
to take the other side.
Yeah.
Kamala Harris's sister should not have been on this commission. She was Maya Harris, and she's a fine person and yada yada, but she had a bias. It was an appearance of bias. It's not right. I wrote a piece last week asking the question, and this is the title: is Unity and Reform Commission fatally flawed? And it argued that there were too many people with axes to grind on this commission.
Yeah.
And I think it proved to be true. I think it fatally flawed. Now, anyway, so that amendment on caucuses, which was a simple and not a draconian one, was tabled, i.e. rejected. Because if it's tabled, that's not that it was turned down, but it didn't come up and it's not going to be in the recommendations. It might as well have been voted down.
Yeah.
All right. So what happens with the primaries? This is the part that gets me. The Sanders delegates proposed a rule that will require state parties to take provable positive steps in the parlance of the language, to push for same-day registration. You may not know this, but they have held that as a poster child, a negative poster child. The state of New York, has a rule that says it's a closed primary, so you have to be registered as a Democrat, and they have a rule in the electoral laws from 1970. It's called the Goodell Rule. It had nothing to do with Bernie Sanders. It's been on the books for 47 years. But it said that in order to switch parties, you have to do it 25 days before the last general election. The general elections in New York are always in November, and they have them almost every year. So you have a general election every year. So what happened was New York had a general election in 2015 in November. So in order to switch parties, you needed to do it 25 days before that.
Right.
They showed up in April of 2016. Lo and behold, people couldn't switch parties. Oh, you know what? 200 days is too much. But there's a lot of different ways you can solve the 200-day problem. No one thought of this one. I did. Why doesn't New York get to go first then? We can cut 90 days out of the wait.
Oh, that's a point.
Oh, no. The Iowa caucus. Excuse me, David. The Iowa caucus is the most important thing in the Democratic Party, and there's nothing more. You can't even think of anything that might possibly hurt the Iowa caucus, even as ridiculous as thinking the Iowa government is going to destroy it, is anathema, and you as a Democrat cannot possibly be allowed to even consider that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, here's what they did. Okay, but I'm fine. I'm for same-day registration. More voters. Let's go back to my North Star argument. If I'm going to be consistent, I should be for same-day registration. Therefore, I am.
Okay.
All right, so what do we do? Well, what can the New York State Democratic Party do? What can it do?
Well, in the face of a state law about only prevail upon its members in the legislature to advocate for change.
What if I can't convince the legislators to do that?
You're
what if I can't
corrupt,
convince the
and I hate
governor
you,
to do
and you have to give me all your money and let me have it, and I get to run because you're corrupt. I don't know. Nothing.
Nothing. Well, you know what happens if this says you have to litigate. You have to sue somebody.
Oh, okay.
Who pays for the lawsuit?
Right. I don't know. I mean, presumably in a fair world, you do.
Did you throw the litigation? Who gets to decide if you tried hard enough?
Yeah. There's
okay. And what happens if they decide you didn't try hard enough?
Again, they
get to strip by this rule. They get to strip your delegates. They get to take away your representation at the convention and in the process for selecting our presidential nominee. That is draconian. And you know what? I'm not opposed to draconian measures. Here's my counter proposal, David. I propose that any state that has a caucus should be stripped of its delegates unless they do all these same things. Who's with me?
I guess that would be an appropriate counterbalance. If you're not working hard enough to get rid of your caucus, somebody has to make that decision, that you didn't really try, right? So you, I suppose, lose your delegates.
David, they would not even approve an amendment or a rule that would have required state parties to hold to honor existing primaries.
Right.
They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to lobby anybody. They don't have to sue anybody. Just take the results of the primary. Okay, that's how the delegates are chosen. They wouldn't even agree to that rule. But over here, when it's the rule they want, they're willing to strip New York of all its delegates.
Well, that does sound, it reinforces your point about maybe the Clinton representatives on this commission not being up to speed.
They were terrible, incompetent, unprepared, disgraceful.
Well, you know, I don't know what to say except, I mean, I'm sorry that happened, but then we keep saying you gotta learn the rules, you gotta learn the process.
They aren't right.
And
I blame Hillary Clinton as much as anybody for what happened this week.
They didn't.
I really do.
Yeah,
she didn't care about it. You know, the explanation isn't a bad one, but it's not an excuse. She thought she was going to win. What did she care about the damn rules? She was going to be the incumbent. No one was going to challenge her.
Yeah, and she's probably not going to, or probably wasn't thinking of running again. And I don't really care what the rules are next time either.
I don't care what the rules are. I'm done with that. And that's inexcusable. I mean, that's an explanation. It's not an excuse.
Yes.
Do you care about the Democratic Party at all? Do you think this process matters? Or was this just because of what it means to Hillary Clinton?
Yeah, well, I guess another possible.
The only importance was what was the impact on Hillary Clinton, and that's
then that
wrong.
would be bad. That would be. I guess suppose it's also possible that again she thought she would win on this too. Like, there's no way that they wouldn't see the obvious logic of requiring, for instance, countermeasures of the same draconian nature, or of course everybody is going to oppose the or promote wider participation and be pro-primary and anti-caucus, generally speaking, because the logic is so obvious. And also, I will say that for the thing that confused me about this whole the weekend's results was the amount of time that Sanders supporting people that we spoke to insisted that, oh no, we're absolutely with you on that. There should absolutely be primaries and not caucuses, and we should do everything we can to push for the elimination of caucuses and the recognition of primaries instead. But we weren't talking to delegates to this commission because the story we got turned out to not be the position of Sanders supporters on the commission after all.
No. Well, Bernie prepared his people better. They knew their objectives, and they carried them out.
We told them to do that, and that they would get their way if they did, and we were right. So shame on us, I guess. Too bad.
That's absolutely true.
We'll have to take our 1 minute break, and we can continue, if you like, after this. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. We will continue into our third segment and wrap things up here with Armando. I think those of you who are fans of the big Armando rants certainly got your money's worth, which is to say, well, you made out like a bandit because we don't charge for entry here. We should, but we don't. But of course, many of you, thank you very much stepping up and contributing to help support the show. And we'll probably be badgering the rest of you at some point during the show later on. But we're here to wrap things up. I am baffled at all this, but as I was saying on our way out to the break and then a little bit during the break, I suppose we should be happy, and to some extent, we told Bernie Sanders supporters all along that all they needed to do was familiarize themselves with the process and learn the rules and learn how to amend the rules and come and do the work and represent and show up. And, of course, we thought that probably the same thing would be happening on the other side. And so, therefore, you'd just have a contest of zealous advocates. And the outcome would be, generally speaking, somewhere in the neighborhood of fair. But apparently one side forgot to show up with zealous advocates, and that's on them. And in 2020, we'll see whether these new fantastic rules do anything to make people think that the process was fair. We told them they could defeat the rigging by showing up and doing the work. They seem to have run the table on the questions before the commission. And if we're not in a socialist utopia in 2021, you'll know where to turn.
That's true. I just do want to close with this because I'm very angry about the process for a couple of reasons. I felt like we could resolve the issues here. And therefore, the fights and disputes could be over. You know, whatever it is, the rules are set, there you go. But that didn't happen. So we go we have to continue the fight in the next stage, because what the Unity and Reform Commission does is present recommendations to the DNC's Rules and Bylaws Committee, also known as the RBC. Now, the RBC is again going to be stacked against Sanders. In the sense that there will be almost certainly more establishment-type Democrats on it. And I give credit to one Mr. James Zogby, who I detest, as a dishonest person, but he knows what the fight's about. He proposed a rule at the URC that if you voted on these proposals at the URC, you'd be recused from voting for on the vote and before the RBC. He's very smart. A few of the members, mostly designated by Clinton, are on the Rules Committee.
Yeah.
So if they lost here, they get another bite at the apple. They get the vote again, and hopefully try to vote it down. Zogby knew the game, and he's going to be screaming rigged about that, by the way, if he loses. So be prepared. But anyway, now it goes to the Rules Committee. But I'll be honest with you. If the level of engagement, preparation, and understanding is the same as what I saw at the Unitarian Reform Commission, Sanders will roll the Rules Committee too.
All right.
And people misunderstand something. They think that the entire DNC will get a crack at this necessarily. That's not true. If the RBC adopts them, then that's it. It's over. It's only if it doesn't. And frankly, at this point, you need to hope the RBC does not adopt it. Then the URC reconvenes and says, hey, you didn't adopt all my recommendations. I demand a full vote on all my recommendations, the ones that weren't adopted. Mm-hmm. And by rule, according to the resolution, they have I assume it's a commission vote on this, and maybe that will be what stops them. But again, they got rolled before, so I have no trust in the URC. They can get a full vote of the DNC membership. That's 447 members, and then you got to get to work and lobby and educate 447 people. When you couldn't even do it with 10 or 11, I'm not very confident you're going to do it with 447.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for a disaster, and frankly, you're going to have to get to work. You could have stopped it now. You could have stopped the mess now. The people involved weren't ready. And listen, this goes all the way to the top. Tom Perez was so disengaged, doesn't even know what's going on. He gave a stupid speech. Then he sent out a stupid tweet. This is actually one of the most important functions of the DNC, and the chairman of the DNC didn't have a clue. Or if he did have a clue, then he's terrible. He's an abject failure as chairman of the Democratic Party. And I thought this now for months, and it's all confirmed now. Hopefully it doesn't matter, because I don't think the DNC matters that much. This is the stuff that mattered, and he failed at it. Absolutely failed at it. This is not going to bring unity, and it's certainly not going to bring good reform. To say I'm disappointed is an understatement. I'm disgusted, and I think so lowly of all the people involved that I've lost all respect for them on every level. This mattered, David, in the sense that it really is going to matter going forward, getting voter participation increased in the presidential process, and frankly, just neutering any cries of rigged and all this nonsense. And that opportunity was lost. So I condemn everybody involved. You did a terrible job. Go home and stand in the corner. You just should be ashamed of yourself. That's my wrap up of the Unity and Reform Commission.
I like it. It's unusual. It's not the sort of thing you typically hear on the radio, right? It's usually, I congratulate everyone for their hard work. I condemn you all. You've done a terrible job. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Go home and never come back. Wow. All right.
That's my conclusion. It's my reasoned conclusion, my very calm and reasoned conclusion on this. Look, they didn't care about it. Here's the thing. They're probably good people. They're probably not stupid. They didn't care. And if you don't care, why are you on the commission?
I don't know. The only thing I can think of is that they might have, and I did wonder about how much of this might happen. That people are like, well, look, I'm sympathetic in a way to the Sanders supporters who feel like they were shut out of a fair process. But then again, if you think Sanders supporters obviously think they weren't involved in a fair process. But I mean, if you have any interest in defending the fairness of it, and maybe they didn't. Maybe they. I'm sure Sanders supporters could take that as, look, see, we were right. Even the people who were supposed to defend the system as fair know it's not fair, and they surrendered right away. Well, I guess that's possible.
I guess that's possible. If that's their conclusion, then they're not very bright.
Yeah, well,
not the people who are saying it. The people who decided it wasn't.
The people who are saying it happened to would have been right, I guess, if if that's what they thought.
I go more to the indifferent and lazy explanation, and that's a condemnation too.
But
anyway, I've ranted enough. You've got 15 minutes of important things to talk about, so I'll leave you to that.
Figure out what they are.
People won't remember this in a month, much less 3 years from now. In which case, they'll remember in 2020, oh, yeah, these rules aren't fair. Well, you know what? This was the time to talk about whether they're fair or not. And so you've lost your chance.
Yeah, and I mean,
if you don't do it now.
I'm sure there will be no tears shed by people who felt that the 2016 process wasn't fair, to find people who they thought were victimizing them crying in 2020 that the process isn't fair. But it's not unity or reform either.
It's none of those things. It's none of those things.
Is problematic.
It was an unmitigated travesty farce. And I could not be more disgusted by it.
A total disaster as well.
Exactly.
So we'll throw that one in there too. Okay. Well,
total
thanks.
Total disaster. It absolutely was just, awful. Anyway, on to other things. I'll leave you be. Thank you for letting me rant. I was going to do this tomorrow, but Greg being wrong about his technology gave me my chance.
Bumped us up. Okay. Well, we'll have to find something to fill the hole with tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Yes. All right. Thanks, Armando. Well, you got your, like I say, you got your money's worth on the Armando ranting this morning. And this is true. There's a lot of, I'm interested. Too late, of course, but I was interested in the run up to things, mostly because it was procedural and because I find those sort of fights interesting. But mostly, I guess I'm a little bit disappointed in the result. Not necessarily, certainly there are some things I disagree with as far as the outcome of what the commission will be recommending, I guess, in its final report, for largely the reasons Armando stated. I guess I'm disappointed in that. I'm not disappointed in Sanders supporters on the commission preparing and doing the work that was necessary to advocate for their positions and trying to see whether a fair and open process could possibly result in their carrying the day. I told them they ought to do such a thing. I didn't listen to. They didn't get that advice from me. I said they ought to do such a thing. And I said it because most people think they ought to do exactly such a thing. But we articulated it here on the show. Okay, that's about as much credit as we can possibly give ourselves for it. They knew what they had to do, and they did it. I did assume that Clinton's people on the commission would be doing likewise. And I guess I'm disappointed by the fact that I still haven't settled for myself. I don't know whether Sanders people would agree that the question is settled because it's been settled in their favor. They might very well say, well, we did what you said we were supposed to do and we prevailed. What do you want us to do now? What I wanted to have happen was an even contest of equally prepared sides advocating for their positions and then holding a vote and seeing who carries the day based on, zealous advocates having represented the positions before everybody on the same day at the same time, and taking the temperature of the room there with the vote, as opposed to, well, why don't we have Bernie Sanders' side prepare their arguments and bring them forward and have a collection, some ragtag collection of people who say they're there for the Hillary Clinton side show up and figure out on the spot possibly what they ought to be doing, whether they speak to one another about it or not. I was hoping maybe for a fairer contest, which is a huge irony, given that the Sanders people were only asking for a fair contest, and they still didn't get it. But this time, of course, it was rigged in their favor, and so I guess they're they're pretty happy with it. And on balance, I guess everything works out. It all comes out in the wash. Well, the primary was rigged in Clinton's favor, and the Unity and Reform Commission was rigged in our favor. So that's a rigging and a rigging, and it comes out as a net zero. So I suppose you could argue it that way. That would make no particular sense, since the stakes in one was the nomination for the presidency, and the stakes in the other is what goes into a report that goes to the Rules and Bylaws Committee, which is itself going to be another layer in the process, and also likely to be at least accused of being rigged by somebody somewhere. So, but anyway, I mean, I'm not terribly concerned yet, I guess, until I have more opportunity to absorb the impact of all of this. And, but there's also some level at which, okay, these are the rules. I think we can play within these rules and manage things. I don't know that there's anything. It depends on who the other candidates are. If there's a contested primary and Bernie Sanders is involved in it, I don't know if there's anything inherent in the rules as they'll be set for 2020 based on the work of this commission that makes it difficult or impossible for a different candidate to surge in popularity and move and put themselves in a position to capture the nomination. But I guess we'll see as time wears on, as we play test this thing once or twice, we'll begin to see where the choke points are and whether this is really designed to result in a real open and fair nominating process, or whether it's simply a change in the kind of rigging and designed to nominate one particular person or not. I don't know. It's certainly hard to point at these things now and say this is outcome determinative for Bernie Sanders and for no one else. No one else could possibly take advantage of this mechanism. I don't see anything on its face that says just that. So now I'm curious about the article that Greg sent to us. Let's take a look at this one in the New York Times. Is the Democratic Party becoming too democratic? We might as well dedicate the balance of the show to this question as well. It is an important one. And as far as I know, Donald Trump isn't screaming about anything. And even if he was, I don't think that would change our lives this morning the way this will. Although this has a delayed effect. It'll change our lives later. Is the Democratic Party becoming too democratic? Our two political science types, as Greg told us there were, are Julia Azari and Seth Maskett. And let's go. Doesn't look like it's even all that long here. Over the weekend, the Democratic Unity Reform Commission issued recommendations aimed at giving power back to the party's grassroots. The recommendations would cut back the number of so-called superdelegates by 60%. In an effort to loosen elite control over the presidential nominating process and make the party more democratic. Interestingly, as I heard Armando's description of the changes to superdelegate status, it seems to me that superdelegate status was preserved for the elite and eliminated for the grassroots, ironically enough. But I guess it depends on your definition of elite. There are certainly those who would maintain that members of the Democratic National Committee are the elite. Now, vis-a-vis, let's say, members of Congress, I would say, it seems to me, it feels like members of Congress are a little more elite than members of the Democratic National Committee. But because it's a national committee and a relatively small number of people from a population of 300 million plus to, talk about 400 people, well, that's pretty elite. Well, of course, Congress even more elite than that, and Democratic members of Congress at that, more elite still. But the recommendations cut back the number of so-called superdelegates by 60%, and those who remain are the ones who are members of Congress, versus people like Chris Reeves, who do the work of advocating, organizing, and campaigning among their local Democrats, who do the real work that counts as party building, and the reward for it is you're on the Democratic National Committee, but because we hate superdelegates, we're going to let members of Congress remain superdelegates, but you can't. Okay, but on the whole, as Armando explained, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, I guess if you focus on the question only of, well, you'll either be a superdelegate or you won't. There it is. You get everything in the universe or you get nothing in the universe. That makes the choice, that much more stark, and it doesn't really reflect reality. There's plenty of things that you can do and should do and are happy to do as members of the Democratic National Committee. And the question of whether you vote in proportion, whether you're stuck voting like the rest of your delegates in proportion to the outcome of your contest, or can vote your conscience. I mean, for the most part, in most contests, it won't bother you a great deal to vote the way your state did, because in all likelihood, you're a member of that state grassroots. You had, in all likelihood, an equal shot anyway of being on the side of the person you end up being forced to vote for from the beginning. And if it's a close contest, the worst thing that could happen to you is that the odds are 50-50. But anyway, I find that right off the bat troubling that 60% of the superdelegates being eliminated are people who actually live and spend their entire lives, working in and mingling among the rank and file of the Democrats in that state, versus people who have arguably gone Washington on you. But okay. These recommendations, the article continues, illustrate the types of reforms we often see connected to democracy within parties. But these reforms are actually difficult to define and implement across many states. Part of the reason it's difficult to make a party internally democratic is that this is the wrong way to think about parties. Oh, yes. That is a thing. The concept of democracy within a political party is tricky. As with many other institutions, parties have become more democratically run over time. Important decisions like nominations and platform stances used to be made by bosses and convention delegates, and now they're largely determined by rank-and-file voters in primaries and caucuses. I don't know so much about platform stances, that being the case. I think that's rather still controlled by, if not bosses, then at least convention delegates. I don't know that it's accurate at all to say primary voters determine platform stances. But okay. Chiefly, they're talking about nominations. The logic of running things more democratically is that people tend to have more faith in the resulting decisions, and so therefore those choices are more legitimate. Like just about any other institution, a party requires legitimacy to operate. It makes many decisions on behalf of its members and operates the complex caucuses, primaries, conventions, and other machinery that boil down dozens of candidates into just one nominee. Similarly, it tries to weigh the many wide-ranging views of its members into a coherent platform. For it to do these things and still get roughly half the votes of the American electorate, people have to have some faith that its actions are done in good faith. But parties have come under considerable strain in this area in recent years. Americans now see them as the nation's most corrupt institutions. This is actually dangerous for the nation, as democracies without functional parties are often tumultuous and short-lived. Part of the problem for parties is our insistence that they be run democratically. All right, now you're getting interesting. Why is that? That turns out not to be a very realistic concept. Yes, we can hold elections within parties, but party leaders will always have vastly more information about candidates, their strengths and flaws, their ability to govern and work with Congress, their backing among various interest groups and coalitions than voters and caucus goers do. I can agree with that. That information is useful, even vital, to the task of picking a good nominee. That's actually most of my argument for superdelegates, particularly those who are members of Congress. So I'm actually happy, at least with the compromise. They clearly seemed like they were destined to adopt a rule about superdelegates that reduced their number. And I suppose that if you're making the argument that superdelegates are, well, as they're making this argument, that party leaders, and in particular, I think even more than local and state party leaders, members of Congress, they will have, like he said, like they say here, vastly more information about the candidates, their strengths, their flaws, ability to govern and work with Congress. Who knows better about their ability to work with Congress than Congress? Actually, I mean, Congress is sometimes so dumb, whatever. But on its face, the question seems like a rhetorical one. And so I guess if they're going to eliminate somebody, I suppose in that sense, you can be glad that they eliminated the ones that of any superdelegates, I suppose you could argue they were the ones with the least likelihood, if there is such a thing, to know those things, and presumably members of Congress have a better idea whether a certain candidate can work with Democratic members of Congress than even state party chairs do, though they very well may have a very good picture of that themselves. Okay, so that information, as they said, is vital to the task of picking a good nominee. As the political scientist E.E. Schatzschneider once said, that famous, not that famous with me, E.E. Schatzschneider, the political scientist, once said, democracy is to be found between the parties, not within them. Between the parties and not within them. Casting doubts about a party's legitimacy, in particular picking a presidential nominee, can have real electoral consequences. Yes. In 2016, Senator Bernie Sanders highlighted Hillary Clinton's contributions from well-heeled donors, and particularly her strong support among the party's superdelegates, as signals that the nomination contest had been fixed for her, and that the only way for the Democratic Party to be truly democratic would be to nominate Mr. Sanders, which, of course, I don't know that he explicitly advocated, but certainly people accused him of advocating that, and that's not particularly democratic. The only way for you to be democratic is to nominate me. Why? What if people get together and count up how many votes there are, and there are millions more for the other person, as actually happened, for instance? Well, how do you answer that charge? By the spring of 2016, Democratic legitimacy was the overwhelming rationale of his campaign. In the general election, roughly 1 Sanders supporters in 10 ended up voting for Donald Trump, and many young voters defected for third-party candidates, possibly costing Mrs. Clinton the election in several key states. Big question mark there. I don't know how much faith you want to put in that, but it's out there. This also happened in 1924. Apparently, when Democrats held a famously divisive convention that spanned 2 weeks and 103 ballots. William Gibbs McAdoo of California fought to a nomination stalemate against Governor Al Smith of New York, a favorite of the Tammany Hall organization. McAdoo ran a deeply populist campaign aimed at maximizing his apparent Democratic legitimacy. He ran in over a dozen primaries, a very rare approach at that time. He held numerous rallies among his supporters and claimed their mandate for leadership, all the while warning about the sinister forces trying to undermine his nomination. During the convention, after the 77th ballot, he gave a rousing speech to his delegates claiming, "I feel that I have to carry out the mandate of the people," arguing that his candidacy symbolized democracy itself. Remarkably, in a contest between a Catholic New Yorker, Smith, and a Klan sympathizer, McAdoo, internal party democracy had become the defining issue of the campaign. Can we legitimately lean on a excuse of, it was a different time? Yowza. Okay, but this argument, no, Bernie Sanders isn't a member of the Klan. But this argument, however dramatic, wasn't enough for McAdoo to win the nomination. Unable to secure the necessary 2/3 of delegates, he and Smith eventually bowed out and made way for John W. Davis of West Virginia. Democrats divided, and they lost in a rout to Calvin Coolidge that fall. Today, Democrats are undergoing some deep and valid soul-searching. The Unity Commission came with no shortage of internal division, but it's what's happening when but it's what happens when a party insists on being too democratic, and when candidates use democratic appeals as a cudgel to undermine their opponents. Yes, Democrats did well in recent elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and elsewhere, but those victories papered over very serious rifts that could affect it during the next presidential election cycle. Tensions between party factions don't have to result in lasting hostilities. You know what? We're missing our outro music there. Not our outro, but our break music. All right, well, where were we? Tensions between party factions don't have to result in lasting hostilities. As a candidate in 2004, Howard Dean made similar claims to grassroots support and a bid financed by small donors, but Mr. Dean exited the nomination contest early on, endorsing the presumptive nominee, John Kerry, by the end of March. We'll take our break and be right back. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show. Hopefully we got most of the end of that paragraph in there before our hard-timed break came in, but in case we missed a second or two, just to summarize the end of that last article, they were talking about the fact that we did have similar tensions in the 2004 nominating contest, Howard Dean making similar claims to grassroots support and a bid financed by small donors. But Mr. Dean, different from this time around, exited the nomination contest early on, endorsing the presumptive nominee and eventual nominee, John Kerry, by the end of March. And so, in conclusion, there's really only a couple paragraphs left here. Parties have something of a dual purpose. The writers point out they need to win elections, but also find a way to channel the different voices within their coalitions. We're always talking about coalitions here. Sometimes those goals mesh well, and at other times they're in tension. The belief that parties should be internally democratic, which has gained wider acceptance over time, and with the Reform Commission is likely accelerating, has altered the way parties balance those two objectives. Candidates who lose the nomination can protest on democratic grounds and gain traction in doing so. But there's a real danger in taking this path. It undermines both the nominee and the party, both immediately and in the long run. And it undermines one of the necessary, if difficult, aspects of democracy, conceding gracefully when you lose. I think that's actually quite an important point. By the way, in terms of who you've been listening to, their voice, the writers here, Julia Azari, as they include in the bios printed at the bottom here, is an associate professor of political science at Marquette University and the author of Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate. Seth Maskett, co-writer here, a professor of political science and director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver, and the author of The Inevitable Party, Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail and How They Weaken Democracy. So, yeah, they're coming at it from an interesting perspective, to be sure. But they raise some good, valuable, and interesting points well worth thinking about as we see the end of this first stage and where things go from here when things move to the Rules and Bylaws Committee. All right. Other things happening, to be sure, but this is some important stuff, and it actually makes me think it might be worth checking in on the piece we discussed last week, and I think it was recommended by Greg. The Democratic Party is fine, and it is the most united American party in modern political history. That's the Sean McElwee piece from last week that probably deserves some consideration here as part of our closing segment. The Democratic Party is divided, and this was, of course, published prior to this last weekend of work of the Unity and Reform Commission. It's not hard to find headlines that either assert that as a fact or argue it. From Hillary Clinton's book keeps Democrats divided, thanks to the Washington Examiner, not a real friend to Democrats, to Democrats are united against Trump, divided on everything else, Also, thanks to the Wall Street Journal. And then lastly, to Democrats determined to wage civil war forever, according to the Daily Beast. And divided Democratic Party debates its future as 2020 looms, according to Time. Well, pundits are united on this point. The punditocracy normally frame this divide as reflecting the aftermath of the 2016 primary. Democrats sweat Clinton versus Sanders rift, Politico tells us. The Hill's Dick Morris was more definite, but also weirder and dumber, saying that the 2016 primary will divide the Democratic Party for the next decade. And now that we have the upshot of the Unity and Reform Commission, maybe it will. On Twitter, it's easy to find Clinton and Sanders backers sniping at each other, and it seems like every week there's a new group that wants to influence the future of the party. Now, the reality, according to Sean, if you look at the premise of the Democratic disarray through a long lens, you'll see that the divides within the party are the smallest they've ever been. After the 1964 election, many party elites sought to make parties more ideologically divided, though the seeds of this realignment existed as early as FDR's time. Republicans believed they could use racism to divide the Democratic coalition and win over Southern whites. Progressive Democrats, frustrated that their coalition relied on segregationists, sought to run racial liberals who were pro-civil rights in primaries and tie anti-racism liberalism to economic liberalism. For decades, Democrats were able to maintain some power in the South, partly due to the stickiness of partisanship, seniority on committees, aggressive gerrymandering, and running moderate candidates like Al Gore in Tennessee, Jim Hunt in North Carolina, and Bill Clinton in Arkansas, all of whom used working-class appeals and centrist economic positions to unite, or at least satisfy, all factions of the party. A newspaper account of Jimmy Carter's 1970 gubernatorial bid noted that he ran a populist-type campaign that was aimed at winning the supporters of George Wallace as well as those of poor blacks. Carter opposed school busing to reduce segregation and invited George Wallace to Georgia. As the political scientist Donald S. Strong noted following Republican James Martin's 1966 loss for Alabama governor, no one doubted that Congressman Martin was an Alabama segregationist, but it is hard for a rich man's segregationist to beat a poor man's segregationist. Occasionally, the more racially liberal wing of the party would win a key primary with mixed general election success, but for the most part, racially conservative or at best moderate candidates have dominated the party, ranging from Mississippi arch-segregationist Jim Eastland to South Carolina's Ernest Hollings, who voted against Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall's appointment to the Supreme Court, but voted for many civil rights bills and oversaw the integration of Clemson University. This led Virginia liberal Democrat Henry Howell to complain to the Washington Post, "Hell, Democrats, real Democrats, haven't won an election for governor in Virginia for 100 years. At the presidential level, intra-party battles were far more vicious in the past than in 2016, driven largely by the civil rights movement and opposition to the Vietnam War." Osita Nwanevu's excellent summary of presidential politics from the 1970s to now shows how deeply divided the party was, and it is herein linked. After the 1968 election, the McGovern Commission, which created diversity quotas for delegates and abandoned an elite selection process for Democratic primaries, empowered the newer coalition, a younger, more diverse wing of the party. And now here we begin entering into some points that we've made in the past here on this show. That is, that a lot of what is being attacked or was being attacked today by Unity and Reform Commission supporters from the Sanders side as ossified elitism was in fact just the last round of populist reform. But, things age, and you're only a progressive party if you continue to make progress. So it's not necessarily that great a point that some of the things you now oppose were once considered progressive reforms. But it is interesting to note that that's the case, and very often the reformers themselves, or those who advocated for the reform, are still around and still believe themselves to be reformers and still believe themselves to be progressive reformers at that. And it creates interpersonal problems when you accuse them of being an ossified elite, even if in your view they are. I mean, but there's that's just the vinegar way of trying to attract flies. And even in the old saying that you can attract more flies with honey than you can with vinegar, that's probably true. Can you attract any flies with vinegar? I guess that's a real question. But I'm asking that seriously. There must be a reason why that's included, right? I mean, you can attract more flies with honey than you can with a brick. That could have been that too. Well, you can't attract any flies with a brick. And personally, I've never run the experiment, but I have to assume that somewhere along the line, flies go to a lot of terrible stuff. I got to be honest with you, because honestly, there's some other folk wisdom out there about different substances that attract flies, some of which you can't mention on the radio, though we're not on any public airwaves radio. But you get the idea. There's flies typically swarming around, let's say, something not nearly as attractive as honey. And maybe it's because the actual saying is probably you can attract more bees that way. But you can attract yellow jackets, and that's important. Anyway, the point is that I don't know. What the hell was the point again? Yes. The point is that you're still talking about members of the party apparatus and isolating yourself from them by saying you are an evil elite is not always a great way to move anything forward, unless you're able to push them aside entirely. And even then, we don't know that that's necessarily a great result. Anyway, get back to some actual collected and organized thought. We'll continue with Sean McElwee's writing here. McGovern lost to Nixon in 1972, but his electoral coalition looked very much like the one that eventually became the base of Democratic support. Women, college-educated whites, people of color, and the youth. However, this group of people did not make up a large enough share of the electorate to deliver him a victory. But it sure looked good inside the Democratic Party. That's the point. Okay. In the 90s, the centrist wing, led by Bill Clinton, won control of the party, but the decade was hardly a period of unity for the Democrats. Below Clinton's two presidential wins, in which he employed moderate anti-government appeals with coded racial rhetoric designed to appeal to white voters, the progressive faction of the party was still alive. Some of Clinton's aides resigned after he supported a racist welfare reform bill, Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. Remember that, of course, that brutalized the poor, according to Sean here, a bill which deeply divided his cabinet. In 1992, the moderate Senator Alan Dixon of Illinois lost a primary to Carol Moseley Braun, partly because of his vote to put Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. Beverly Byron of Maryland and Charles Hayes of Illinois both lost primaries in 1992 to more progressive Democrats. I remember that as well. Despite talk of Democrats being united during the Bush era, divides still existed from positions on the Iraq War to abortion to gay marriage. The moderate wing of the party exerted significant influence but faced challenges from a newly energized progressive wing. In 2000, conservative California Democrat Matthew Martinez was defeated in a primary by progressive Hilda Solis, who eventually served as Obama's Secretary of Labor. In 2002, Thomas Sawyer of Ohio lost his primary to Tim Ryan due to his vote for NAFTA and an unfavorable redistricting cycle. In 2006, Joe Lieberman lost a primary to progressive Ned Lamont, who hammered him for his support of the Iraq War. Lieberman, of course, held on to his seat by running as an independent. Bush's tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, unlike Trump's, were passed with a modicum of Democratic support. The election of Obama in 2008 sealed the end of the centrist Democrat era, though I find that an amazing statement in the face of, progressives and populists that we've spoken to and admired in the past couple of years, who, of course, said, no, Obama was a continuation of the centrist Democrat era, but okay. Interesting. So it sealed the end of the centrist Democrat era, and I think that's largely right, actually. But okay. And the 2016 primary showed this reality. Presidential candidates like Jim Webb, who wanted to pursue a path of racially moderate appeals, were doomed. The number of pro-life Democrats in the House has dwindled from more than 36 to 3 in less than a decade. And in 2009, 64 House Democrats voted for an amendment to exclude abortion coverage from the Affordable Care Act. By 2015, only 3 of those Democrats voted for a similar measure. 9 Democrats had flipped their position. The rest were no longer in the House. Of the 34 Democrats who voted against the Affordable Care Act, 3 remain, and 1 faces a competitive primary. During this period, as research by political scientists Seth Hill and Chris Tosanovich shows, primary voters became more consistent ideologically, bringing about fewer conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. This brings us to today. A Democratic Party united in opposition to Trump and in closer alignment on issues like abortion, healthcare, and climate change. This is not to say the party is completely united. The core question at the heart of it is what it means to be a progressive or a liberal, rather than what the party should be, or whether the party should be liberal or progressive. That seems to be, I guess, a settled question. On most core issues, the party became more united. And that's a good point. Take one question that is a standard measure of racial resentment. Quote, it's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites, unquote. As the chart below shows, Democratic primary voters have become far more opposed to that sentiment since 2008, as the party has sorted to become more racially liberal, supportive of more action to alleviate racial inequality, and supportive of more immigration. As the chart below shows, and that's now the next chart up on this thing, which you'll have to see for yourselves, Democratic primary voters in 2016 were more likely to agree with the more progressive position than they were in 2008 on issues like abortion, immigration, and government spending. In the case of abortion, respondents were also offered the option of supporting abortion in some instances or never at all, and the share supporting abortion in all cases increased. The share saying never remained around 8%. In 2016, in the Democratic primary, despite all the anger that it inspired on Twitter, it stands out historically for its lack of ugly rhetoric. Many have quickly forgotten the ugliness of the 2008 presidential primary on the Democratic side. In 1992, when California Governor Jerry Brown and Bill Clinton were locked in a primary contest so ugly that Brown refused to concede until the convention. Remember this? Didn't seem to make a big difference, though, in that case. In 2016, the DNC was punctuated with some protest, but no outright violence. At the infamous 1968 convention in Chicago, thousands of law enforcement officials were called to brutally suppress anti-war protesters. As the next chart shows, Democratic primary voters in 2016 were less likely to defect from the party than in 2008. And remember who the defectors were in 2008, by the way, for one of the great ironies of all time. As I've argued in the past, this is consistent across longer time periods, multiple different surveys, and has widespread support in the academic literature. Despite the punditocracy's seemingly never-ending focus on Bernie versus Hillary, pitting the two former candidates against each other is not a helpful way to understand challenges the Democrats face. In the most important primary of 2017, between Tom Perriello and Ralph Northam for governor of Virginia, the core divide was between national and state Democrats rather than those who supported Bernie or Hillary. Clinton's camp, Obama's camp, and Sanders' camp endorsed Perriello, while Northam had the backing of most state officials. I should emphasize this way, most state officials. After Perriello lost, he went across the state campaigning for Northam. Down ballot, the reality on the ground was far from a party in disarray, but rather a broad swath of candidates running from a variety of backgrounds, all with support from the institutional Democratic Party, from a trans woman who wanted to fix the roads to a Democratic socialist advocating for single-payer health care. In the race for governor in Georgia, Stacey Abrams has the endorsement of Emily's List and Nina Turner of Our Revolution in her campaign against Stacey Evans. Neither candidate cuts a Sanders-esque or Clinton-esque mold. To the extent that a Democratic divide emerges, it's mostly conflict between state and local parties and power brokers and national progressives. That is an interesting point, in particular about the Virginia contest, which, of course, I got to see up close. And, that's very interesting that, once again, the question here, Perriello versus Northam, Perriello ends up with the endorsement of Clinton's camp, Obama's camp, and Sanders' camp, but Northam wins with the backing of most state officials. That is to say, the people who are here and apparently know the two candidates best in terms of working with them within the state party. Perriello successfully won a House seat at some point, and then, of course, lost it, but a seat in Congress doesn't bring you in as close contact with state party officials and members of the state legislature as winning statewide office in Virginia does. Not statewide office, and for Senate, it would be a different story. But winning the Attorney General contest and putting yourself in direct contact with the people who run the Virginia state government. It is interesting. Those who work more closely with one candidate than another tended to endorse that candidate, and it really had very little to do with ideology or where you fell in the 2016 primary, which I contend is almost always what's happening. And it wasn't, I would argue, institutional bias or anything. Well, I guess you could call it. It depends on how you define institutional bias. But I guess I should say it wasn't ideological bias. It wasn't a anti-Sanders sentiment that drove most of the people who, through extended service to the party over decades and extensive organizing expertise locally and statewide in their respective home states, became members of what stands for the Democratic Party national elite, and they also, by virtue of having done so much work within the Democratic Party, were more favorably inclined toward that candidate who they had come to know as also having given over that much time and effort to building and organizing the Democratic Party, as opposed to the person who they may even have been more ideologically sympathetic with, but who had spent intentionally spent zero time building and organizing the Democratic Party. They wished, of course, to have a party that was even more progressive, perhaps, than the Democratic Party, but for whatever reason, it was Bernie Sanders' decision not to organize within and work within the Democratic Party, and he may even have had great reasons, and it may even end up having more of an impact long-term on how the Democratic Party organizes itself and holds itself out to voters in the future than the other route. I mean, it's not an illegitimate path by any means, but it is neither an illegitimate decision on the part of the people who, by virtue of their hard work, organizing, and popularity with their own local Democrats, came to be viewed as a Democratic elite. It's no mystery why they felt more connected to and had more confidence in the person with whom they had worked on a shared goal over decades. That's not bias. It's not elitism. It's not selling out to Wall Street. It's knowing who your candidate is and being confident in that person because you've had contact with them versus a stranger who says good things with which you agree. Even that, ideology alone isn't going to be enough. And it turns out that for the most part, people who were new to working within the institutional Democratic Party and organizing it, and who therefore had been exposed equally outside of the party structure to the public persona of Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, felt it was a more open contest for their support, whether or not they agreed that there was an open contest inside the institutional party. I find that considerably less than surprising, and therefore considerably less than surprising to find out that it was the case inside of the Virginia party as well. Even though it strikes me as a bit of news, it seems like it should have been the obvious conclusion. So continuing and hopefully concluding the article here in the next couple of minutes, there are too many other similar candidates to mention here, but I'll bring to light a few. In Texas's 23rd District, Gina Ortiz Jones, a lesbian Filipina Air Force vet, an intelligence expert, is running with the support of Emily's List and former Texas State Senator Wendy Davis. She's pro-choice and has written op-eds about how white supremacy is a threat to the national security, but she's also running to the left of the establishment's choice on economics, talking about her childhood, sometimes relying on government programs, and the need for single-payer health care. Jones's candidacy shows the weakness of understanding a false binary between identity and class as a central divide in Democratic politics. Happening also in Michigan, where gubernatorial candidate Abdul El Sayed comes from the Sanders-esque mold. And there are a few other examples named here, but just to jump to the conclusion so we can wrap things up, without meaning to give short shrift to El Sayed, or El Sayed, perhaps. The future of the party belongs to these candidates, ones who understand that justice is about paychecks and clean water and can mobilize youth without pandering. But the core question at the heart of the party, core questions, have been answered. No credible pundit would argue that the future of the party is bloodless centrism, and the primaries across the country reflect that. The Democrats have work to do and have scars left over from the 2016 primary, but the party is increasingly united on the values of racial justice, immigration, gender equality, gender discrimination, universal health care, and antitrust policy. It is the most united American party in modern political history. If true, fantastic. It's beginning to feel true, and I think it's important to say that it's absolutely to the great credit of Bernie Sanders and his supporters that that's the case. They've made an excellent ideological case for their positions, and as a result, they're finding that the evil, corporate, bloodless, centrist Democrats are en masse moving in that direction and nominating candidates who agree. It just so happens that in the contest in 2016, when you asked Democrats, which of these two candidates do you prefer? For the most part, the answer was the person who's been here alongside us in the fight to organize the Democratic Party for the past several decades, and not the relative newcomer. Most of us having found out about him in the last 5 to 10 years at most as he moved into the Senate, and the vast majority having found out about who he was and what positions he was taking with his declaration of candidacy for the presidency in the last year or so. He was a new entity, and if you're basically new to politics, it didn't matter to you which one had done all this work when you weren't looking. Makes a certain amount of sense, yes. But for others who say, as much as I sympathize with his positions, I'd rather go with this other person with whom I've worked hard and who I think likewise harbors many of the same sympathies and could be moved even further towards the positions being advocated by this other, more enigmatic figure, let's say. And it makes sense that the party could be ideologically uniting behind the positions of Sanders, but the leadership of someone else, the leadership of someone who's demonstrated an ability to lead the institution, which I still think we haven't quite seen from Bernie Sanders, though the first indication of it having come from their successfully having organized and enrolled the entire Unity and Reform Commission. Maybe we should take that as a hopeful sign. It's the best thing we can take away from it, I guess. Don't know whether that's going to be convincing to Armando or not, but at any rate, time for us to hand the microphones over to Justice to bring us the next installation of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy's daily specials. Plenty on tap for you. I'll tell you a little bit about it next.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
As always, there's way too much for me to give you an appropriate taste of everything that's going on, but suffice to say this one, an aperitif of Malcolm Nance declaring that the Trump family is a criminal enterprise. I know you can get with that, plus news of what happened down in the Civil Rights Museum over the weekend. You know we need an update on that one, and Justice has got it for you.